So, the British basket-hilted broad or backsword is self-evidently the best sword ever invented. Okay, no questions. However, actually trying to find a good reproduction broadsword to equip your school has been a bit of a problem. None of the commercially available ones are really all that good, and I've had dozens upon dozens of these things over the years and destroyed most of them. So I've got a fairly good idea about what the design pitfalls are when you're making a basket-hilted sword. And I'm quite excited because today I can reveal to you a fantastic design which I've been trying to get somebody to make for me for about 10 years that avoids all these. So, welcome to the review of the Danelli basket-hilted broadsword. So let's have a quick look at some other sorts of broadswords and what's wrong with them and how the new model fixes all those problems. So this is fairly typical of the sort of reproduction broadsword that I've been using for the last couple of decades. As you can see, it's a fairly accurate reproduction of an actual broadsword. It has a nice long broad blade. It's got a reasonable amount of distal taper in that the last third of the blade is a lot thinner than it is down here at the forte. The hilt in this case is made out of welded bars, though some models use plates and some usually use a mix of plates and bars. And this is actually a really nice, well-balanced weapon, and I'm actually really quite happy with it. It is, however, pretty heavy. Okay, if you get something that is exactly the same width and length as a real sword, with a sharp blade, and then you need to make it blunt, you're obviously going to end up with much more metal in the blade than you do in the real thing, and it's just going to be heavier. Likewise, the hilt is probably a little bit over-engineered, because unlike the real thing, I would use this several times a week in fairly heavy bashing, and I want the hilt not to collapse too often, and I want my hand to be nice and protected in it. So it's a fairly heavy-duty hilt, which also adds weight. And then, of course, once you've got a heavy blade and a heavy hilt, you need to counterbalance it with a heavy pommel. So this one weighs actually a little over 1.5 kilos. And although it is really nicely balanced, and I can swing it around pretty good for me, I do know a lot of people do find this kind of thing just too heavy. The other problem with it, of course, is that it's a custom job that was specially made for me by an armourer. And cost an appropriate amount of money. Commercially, there's not really any broadswords out there that are really up to scratch. This is typical of what is commercially available. This is a Hanway, but there are other brands around and they all share most of the same sorts of problems. So first of all, this is really heavy. This is actually, I haven't weighed it, but it feels heavier than my custom job. There's an awful lot of metal, especially down here in the blade, so it feels quite tip heavy as well. It's way heavier than most of the real broadswords. Okay, yes, you get a few 19th century regimental clunkers, but for the most part a real broadsword should weigh 1 to 1.2 kilos maximum, and some of the 17th century examples are barely a kilo. The hilt is made out of, again, welded bars and plates. It's quite tight, which is an issue that you get with a lot of broadswords. This has been spray painted brass, but don't be fooled, it's still just mild steel. And it's really, really short. Okay, for anybody who's doing silver, this is just way too short. I'm not stupidly tall, and if I measure this as silver's perfect length, as you can see, it's way, way, way too short for me. Whereas opposed to my custom job there, which, as you can see, is just about right. So this is really not a particularly good weapon, okay? But it's the sort of thing that is really the only thing that's been commercially available up till now. The other issue with a lot of basket-hilted swords is, of course, also the basket. So this is a nice shiny She of Honor. The blade is much lighter, and this is much more nicely balanced than the Hanway thing. again, cost an appropriate amount of money to get, and you've got this lovely, complex, shiny basket made out of welded bars again. But these baskets take an absolute battering, and it doesn't take long before you end up with some mashed bit of metal like that you can no longer get your hand into. So this Wagner hilt is going to have to go off to a professional armourer to basically be reshaped, remade, and welded back together before it can be used. And this is a common problem with any sort of basket, in that lots of the bars get struck and welding breaks and they need to be welded back together, and if they're made of flat plates, the plates collapse and they need to be bashed out again, and this usually means that you've got to take it to a proper blacksmith who can take the sword apart and fix it for you, which is again annoying and expensive. Now, hilts like these are also really quite heavy. This is over-engineered. I've played with a number of real Wagners as well as real broadswords, and the hilts are much, much thinner and lighter than anything that we tend to use, because again, we use them all the time. We don't want them to constantly collapse, so we tend to over-engineer them for robustness, which makes them heavier. You can, of course, get hilts made out of much fewer bars that are much lighter and honestly more realistic in that way. A number of manufacturers make really nice Mary Rose style hilts with only just a few bars around it. This one is an Alchem shearing sword with a nice little thumb ring in there, and because you've got very little metal in the hilt itself, the sword is really light and really well balanced and exactly like the real thing. But it doesn't offer much in the way of hand protection, as you can see. A final consideration is to consider if you've got a pommel on the end of your broadsword, how you put that on actually makes a big difference. Now, the vast majority of available broadswords have a screw-on pommel like this. So the pommel screws onto the end of the tang like so, okay, which is fine for easy maintenance, okay. I can take this apart and replace the blade and replace the hilt or fix the hilt myself, and that's good. The problem with it, however, is that blows that come in on the basket, which happens all the time, force is then transferred through the basket into the pommel, and that little rat-tang screw thread there becomes a weak point and they snap. So that's what's happened to this one here. This happens all the time. We have busted literally dozens of blades made in this manner because of this particular issue. And it's really only an issue because you've got a great big weight sitting on the end of this tang, which vibrates and causes a lot of stress, and thus it breaks just there on that side of just where the pommel meets the rest of the tang. The alternative, of course, is to have a full tang all the way through the pommel, like this one. Okay, so that goes all the way through there at full width, and then is paned over with a hammer in traditional medieval fashion. This does not have that issue. Okay, blows to this basket are absorbed by that, and there's no weak point there for it to snap, and that's just fine. However, it causes maintenance issues. Okay, if I break a blade or smash in the hilt and I want to fix it, I can't do that myself. I have to take it to an armourer who's got to take it apart properly and put it back together properly again afterwards. So it's inconvenient. Now, traditionally, of course, broadsword was practiced not with your fancy steel sharp broadsword, but with a single stick, and that's fine. But if you want to also practice with steel, which I'm sure we all do, it would be nice to have something that's going to do the job, be robust enough, but also be of realistic weight and balance. So I commissioned Danelli Armouries in the UK to produce a staccato standard basket hilt. Oh, pussycat. Cats. And here it is. So, first thing about it is that it's the right length. It's nice and long. This one, the prototype, is actually about an inch too long for me for silveresque perfect length. I might do something about that at some stage. But compare it to the commercially available things like the Hanway, which is way, way, way shorter. Okay, this is just not long enough by any measurement for an average person. Whereas this is
long enough for even a tall person. And of course you can get it to whatever length that you like. Yet this weighs a fraction of what this thing weighs. This comes in at 1.1 kilos, which is exactly in the middle of the price range that I was after. So it's much, much lighter than, say, my custom broadsword like this. Okay? So even though this is fairly nicely balanced, it is heavy. This is much, much, much more wieldable. The blade is quite thin. It's much thinner than my historically accurately dimensioned broadsword, but this is much closer to historically accurate weight and balance, and that's the important thing. Despite being thin, the blade is really robust. I've been using this for about a month now, fairly heavily, and the blade has not got a scratch on it. So I'm really, really happy with the quality and tempering of the blade. It bends nicely for thrusting, and it even has this little thick thrusty tip on the end of there if you'd prefer that to a rubber blunt, which is entirely up to you. But the important thing about it is, of course, the hilt. Okay, unlike the complex welded bunch of bars that you get there, this has a nice, simple, smooth, deflective surface. Okay, so blows that come on here tend to just skip and bounce off rather than snap and break stuff. It's got some weight-saving shapes in it, but they're positioned brilliantly so that there's no chance of any sort of blow coming in there. So my hand is really, really secure inside this hilt. Really, really happy with that. You'll also note no pommel. It doesn't need one. The blade is the right weight, the hilt is the right weight, and there's enough metal in here to bring the balance of the sword back to the right place. As Newcastle says, God, it is a ridiculous thing to try and make a sword lighter by adding a heavy pommel. And he's right. So the balance point is about, there you are, about there. And it, despite being quite light, it feels like it wants to cut. It feels like it wants to roll and cut in a nice broadswordy manner. The other nice thing about it is, should you ever need to repair it, should you break a blade and need a replacement, should this require bashing out after receiving some heavy blows or whatever, it's dismantleable. It's all held together just with that simple nut on the end, so you can unscrew that, take it apart, fix or replace what needs replacing, and bang it back together, which is a really, really nice feature. No more trips to the armourer, you can fix it yourself. So, really, really happy with it. 5 stars from me. And this is definitely going to become our standard club sword from now on. We were originally going to call it the Stoccata Standard Basket Hilt. Since then, however, another historical fencing club called Stoccata has popped up in Italy. Now, you can't complain about people using words in their own language, so there it is. So we're going to have to go with the Paul Wagner Basket Hilt. But this is now available from Danelli Armories, so you can contact them about it. But it is absolutely the perfect sword for doing broadsword or silver or 18th century English backsword or anything like that. It is just a marvellous, marvellous piece. wanted something that was of realistic weight and balance, so not too heavy, between 1 and 1.2 kilos. Cat.